Hello, welcome to Gardener's World. Ah, there you are. We've had the most fabulous weather here at Longmeadow for the last 10 days or so. And the warm days and cool nights mean that the autumn colours are getting richer and richer by the day. And of course, balanced with the fading of the light, you get a seasonal intensity that is absolutely wonderful. While it's here, it's a joy. What are you doing? You silly thing.
This week, Carol continues her series on the inner workings of plants.
I'm looking at the science of stems. Stems are incredibly diverse, but whether they're little spindly stems of annuals or huge, great tree trunks, they all work in the same way.
And Rachel visits the art dealer Philip Mould to see how art has influenced his own garden.
For me, this is absolutely thrilling because this was the rose that was being bred at the time that Van Dyck was here immortalising the English society.
And I shall be doing some autumnal housekeeping here at Longmeadow, as well as celebrating the joys of the earthworm. But first, I'm going to plant out some wallflowers. These wallflowers here were sown in the middle of May. First of all into seed trays, then pricked out, and then when they were big enough to handle, they were taken from plugs and lined out on a spare piece of ground. And they've been left to grow nice, strong, bushy plants all summer long. And October is the perfect time to plant them. Now, these have made pretty good bushy plants, so I'm pleased with them. But obviously, if you didn't sow any in spring, it's too late to sow them now, but you can buy them from garden centres, you can buy them online, and they're not expensive. You buy them in bundles, and they're very good value. So this is something that anybody can do. Of course, as well as being a bit cheaper to grow them your own, there is a lot of satisfaction in raising your own plants. And as long as you've got a spare bit of ground, if you've got in a corner of an allotment or a bit of a vegetable garden normally, then you can just line them out and grow them on. But that is necessary because they need to get nice, strong plants. And I've got a variety here called Cloth of Gold. Now, I'm just going to dig these up, a bucket load at a time. When you buy them, the plant should look healthy. You don't want them too yellow, you don't want them too limp. Nice, healthy, strong, bushy plants. I love two things about wallflowers. On the one hand, they add a real splash of colour in April. And the other thing about them is they do have the most wonderful honey scent. They're something I would not be without. Right. I'll go and plant these. Come on, Nige. Come on. Now, obviously, planting wallflowers out is easy enough. You make a hole, you stick them in. The important thing to do is to try and keep as much of that root ball and firm them in really well, and ideally they will hardly know they've been transplanted. Wallflowers like sun, if you can give it to them. They'll take a little bit of shade, but the more sun you can have, the better they'll flower and the better that they will smell too. They make a really good companion for tulips. So I intend to plant tulips in between them. Now, tulip planting doesn't need to happen until November. And wallflowers are biennials. So a good way to plan ahead for them is to clear them away when they finish flowering, which in the case of wallflowers will be May, and the same day sow next year's seeds. So there's a complete rolling continuum. And once you get into the rhythm of it, growing biennials is cheap, easy, fun, and the result gives you really good colour and lovely plants from early spring through to early summer. Now, of course, water them in well. And the whole point of what we're doing now is thinking about next year's garden. Planning, And biennials take you forward into a new season. Come on. There are still some roses flowering in the autumnal sunshine. This is a repeat flower, so it had its first burst in June, July, and now is putting out a last and final flush of flower. It's a rose called Souvenir de Malmaison. And I planted it to remind me of time I spent in France visiting Malmaison, which was the home of Napoleon and his then wife, the Empress Josephine. And she was one of the first people to make a serious attempt to collect all the roses in the world. She loved roses. And if you can find a plant that has meaning to you, whether it's personal or historical, then that certainly increases the worthiness in your garden. And Rachel has been to visit the art dealer, Philip Mould, whose own passion for gardening has been inspired by his knowledge of paintings.
I've loved plants and gardening for as long as I can remember. But before I thought about making horticulture my career, I had another passion, and that was for art history. And today I'm visiting the garden of a long-term hero of mine, and I'm intrigued to see how he combines his own love of art and of plants of all types in his garden.
Art dealer and super sleuth Philip Mould started out as an expert art advisor to the House of Commons some 25 years ago and continues today to uncover rare treasures through his own gallery in London and via our TV screens.
It is such a beautiful house. For me, it just sort of sets the scene for the garden.
All of this comes together, you know, the fields, the garden. It's a very, very important part of my life because I don't think there's anything more beautiful than the English garden, you know, the foxglovey sort of messy look.
Well, I could smell them before I could see them.
Well, I mean, these roses play a very important part in the story because I've been trying to, as far as possible, get roses that would have been around when my favourite artist, Sir Anthony van Dyck, was painting in the 1620s and 30s. And I wanted to get those very same inflorescences that we see in his pictures. Van Dyck was a very subtle symbolist. If he was going to show the man in man, you know, it would be his expression, his posture, his deportment. But every now and then he would add a sword, and that was, you know, the symbol of manhood. But if he was painting you, he would give you a rose, or lots of roses. And the rose was the most glorious symbol in the eyes of 17th century society for womanhood. But it was also an allegory of love. The thorny path, the uncertain pains of love, as well as something that is marvellous, something worth owning, worth having.
So have you got an example in this rose garden of a rose dating from the period of Van Dyck?
Come and have a look.
Now here, of course, you've got one of the classic old roses, Rosa gallica officinalis, the apothecary's rose, and then the sport of that, Rosa mundi here, with that lovely sort of splashing and streaking of white.
And, you know, for me, this is absolutely thrilling because this was the rose that was being bred at the time that Van Dyck was here immortalising British society, English society. So just think, you know, the great Sir Anthony would have looked upon a rose like this. That is connection, you know,
Yeah.
That's tangible art and horticulture coming together. And, of course, you'll notice petals on the ground as well, and that's another thing that you see in Van Dyck's pictures. The petals are falling, and it's another sort of deeply moving aspect of the symbol of the rose. You know, the rose doesn't last long, nor does life.
Well, this has got such a different feel from the relative formality of the rose garden, and suddenly you've got this medley of different colours and textures and shapes. I mean, dare I say, stepping on your toes, that it feels painterly.
There is a group of artists who we've been greatly inspired by, and that's the Bloomsbury Group, which was a sort of melting pot for, you know, bohemia and intelligentsia. They had a love of colour. The artists amongst them, Duncan Grant, Vanessa Bell, you know, loved colour like this. And it's this almost sort of arbitrary juxtaposition of colours, you know, a bit like you would find on a palette.
I like the way that, as you said, you've sort of got big clumps of things like the Achillea, but then you've got this odd penstemon just popping up through there, and a delphinium and a verbascum. So there is a lot in here, but it just works.
Well, I like those sort of happy accidents, like that clematis, which I promise you we didn't train up that apple tree, but just somehow it did it.
And it looks beautiful.
I think there's one artist who links art with garden better than anyone else, and that's Cedric Morris. He understood about breeding plants, in particular irises. And there's one painting I have which shows his innate understanding of plants, because he was a plantsman, but also he's responding to these plants emotionally, to the irises in an artistic way. And to me, it's the fusion of all of those disciplines.
I think you've absolutely achieved what you set out to do, which was create that sort of ebullient cottage garden feel. It's really very special.
There's no doubt that growing a rose that you've read about or seen in a painting from a historical period is thrilling. It's not just seeing it, but smelling it, touching it, and knowing that you have that direct connection to hundreds of years past. We've had a lovely autumn so far with really warm days, and although the nights have been chilly, they haven't been too cold, not a sign of frost, but it can't last. Winter is coming, and with it, frost, perhaps ice and snow, and certainly here at Longmeadow, wind and rain. And a lot of plants will need protection. So this greenhouse becomes a storage place in winter, and I pack in as many plants as possible, whether they be cannas or dahlias or the bananas or whatever it might be. So before they come in, it's really important to give the greenhouse a good clean, to get rid of all the lingering bugs and germs and fungi and slugs and snails that might be lurking in its nether regions. I find a really good stiff brush, but by brushing, the bristles get in all the bits that you can't otherwise reach. And I use a very dilute washing up solution. Now, this is a job that's going to take the better part of a day, even if it's not spread across the weekend. But here are some jobs that are good to do now, but perhaps won't take up all your weekend.
If you plant a hippeastrum bulb now, and we more normally call it amaryllis, it should be flowering around Christmas time. Before you do, it's a good idea to soak the roots in a jam jar of tepid water overnight. Use a terracotta pot that isn't too big, just an inch of space around the bulb is plenty, but make sure it's deep enough for the roots to grow. And use a very gritty, free-draining compost. Leave 2/3 of the bulb above the soil, so there's no risk of rotting. Water it in well, then place it in a warm, light position. A windowsill over a radiator is ideal. You can extend the season of your salad crops if you cloche them. This will protect them from heavy rain as well as the cold, but leave the end of the cloches open to keep them well ventilated. It hasn't been a good year for sweet peas, but to ensure a really good display next year, I'm going to sow some now and another batch in late winter. Whenever you sow them, the technique is the same. Place 2 or 3 seeds in a pot of compost. Cover them, water them, and put them somewhere protected to germinate, but they don't need any extra heat. Once they have germinated, the seedlings can be kept in a cold frame or protected corner over the winter.
You can see that it makes a huge difference to clean the glass in terms of the amount of light coming through. It transforms it. By the way, talking about transformation, you know I put some mushrooms in here, some oyster mushrooms. Well, here are some. These are ready for harvest, and I can just break these off like that. And those fried up in a bit of butter or a nice bit of toast will be delicious. And they should keep producing more mushrooms for quite a few weeks to come, but they can safely stay in that part of the greenhouse. Now, with the greenhouse clear and clean, a huge amount of light comes in here, and that's great. However, we're coming up to winter, and if winter is really cold, I think we need a bit of protection. I've got some bubble wrap here, which is pretty good at keeping the heat in. Now, obviously, there are pros and cons about putting a layer on the glass, because there's no doubt about it, it will reduce the light. But by cleaning the windows, you've upped the light levels. So by knocking them back down again, at least we're no worse than we were before. And the advantage of insulating it is that if we're keeping tender plants in there, that dramatically reduces the amount of energy we need to keep it heated. Now, the first thing to do is measure the lengths. All right, well, that's 70. And that will fit in a panel. And when you're bubble wrapping a greenhouse, basically you're building up panels for each section. And of course you need to do it all, because insulation is only as good as its weakest point.
Starting with the sides, fix the bubble wrap to the frame. I'm using clear all-weather tape, but you could also use small nails or a staple gun in a wooden greenhouse. It's best to choose polythene with as large bubbles as possible, as it has better insulating properties and lets in more light. And you can buy this by the metre from garden centres. And I've found that it will last for several years. Check out our website for more details.
I have to say, if you can get somebody to help you do this, it does make life a lot easier, particularly when it comes to doing the roof of the greenhouse. And if you don't do the roof, there's no point in doing the sides, because otherwise the heat just goes upwards and out. Now, somebody who doesn't need any help at all when it comes to knowing her plants is Carol. And this week, as part of her series looking at the botany of plants, she's exploring the magic of their stems.
For centuries, we've been seeking to unravel the mysteries of plants, to unlock their secrets and enable us to have a better understanding of how they grow. As gardeners, we play a small but important role in maintaining the diversity of plant life on our planet. Yeah, we grow plants because they're beautiful and for our enjoyment. But if we learn more about their botany, it can help us all become much better gardeners. Over the last 2 weeks, we've looked at how seeds germinate and how the roots form to anchor plants, as well as giving them food and water. This week, I'm looking at the science of stems. Stems are like scaffolding that support a plant's leaves and flowers. Some develop tendrils to clamber up to the light, and inside they have tubes as thin as a hair that transport food and water between the roots and the leaves. Stems are just as fascinating as any other part of a plant's anatomy, and they're just as varied too. You can get everything from these flimsy little stems of annuals. This one's bittercress, and all it has to do, that stem, is to support tiny little flowers, let them go to seed, distribute themselves all over the place, and then it's done, it's finished. On the other hand, the stems of herbaceous perennials, although they only last for a year, or only about 9 months of that year, have a much more important job to do. They've got to be strong because they might have to support huge heads of flower, like in the case of this Campanula lactiflora, and afterwards its seed too. They have to be much more substantial, but not nearly as strong as the woody stems of every tree and shrub. And in their case, that structure of stems is permanent. And if you're wondering why on earth I've got a potato in front of me, it's not because I'm hungry, it's because it too is a stem. It's a tuber, which is a swollen part of a stem that stores food. Stems are incredibly diverse, but whether they're little spindly stems of annuals or huge great tree trunks, they all work in the same way. But stems don't just support the plant. Inside, they have an extraordinary structure to transport food and water. And to see that, I'm at Cambridge University Botanic Garden. In the microscope, I've got a cross-section of a stem, and I can see quite clearly here exactly what's happening inside. Round here is a vascular bundle, which is just the name for all these very hair-like cylinders, tubes that carry food and water through the plant. Now, these big ones here, right in the middle, which are very distinctive, they're the xylem, and they carry water and nutrients from the roots and into the body of the plant. And clustered around the edge of them, there are lots and lots of these little tiny phloem tubes. They're the ones that carry food from the leaves right through the plant. Plants have 5 different hormones, of which one is called auxin, and it is responsible for stimulating growth. Auxins come in useful to gardeners too, especially when we're propagating plants. One of the most popular ways of propagating your plants is to take stem cuttings. It's great because you actually get a clone of the plant itself. It's a form of vegetative propagation. And what you're looking for is none of this flowered stuff, but nice, straight stems. And just cut them cleanly across, just sever them. Look at those, beautiful and turgid, all full of water and sap. And I'm going to trim these cuttings now. That's a lovely, strong, straight shoot. I'm just going to cut right under a leaf node, because that's where it's going to root best. And then, before I plunge it into this pot of gritty compost, I'm going to nip out the top. The reason for that is because in every shoot, there's a thing called apical dominance. That means that one of the 5 plant hormones, auxin, which is responsible for plant growth, is actually concentrated in this growing tip. Well, when I put my cutting in there, I don't want it to carry on growing upwards and being a spindly plant. What I want it to do is shoot out sideways. And the minute I nip out that top, it cuts off those auxins. They just switch off, but immediately auxins around these little lateral shoots will switch on, which means that eventually, after this plant's rooted, I'm going to get a really, really lovely bushy plant. Stems are like motorways transporting food and water to every part of the plant, whereas leaves are like solar panels harnessing the sun's energy. We'll be looking at them in more detail next week.
Here, look, this way. Nige, here. Now, I've got a letter here, which is very typical of lots that I receive at this time of year.
And it's from John Erish in Witney in Oxfordshire. And he says, I've started to get problem worm casts on my cherished lawn. Any suggestions about dealing with the problem? Now, it's that word problem that is the problem. Because worm casts are an indication that you've got worms. And worms are the gardener's best friend. And a worm cast, we've got one here, have a look. Looks like this. Worm casts appear on the lawn, particularly in autumn, as bubbles of slightly slimy soil. And what they are is the excreta of worms. And I've got some here. So if we take a worm, actually this one is, whoops, there he goes. There is a worm, which I've dug up. It digests organic matter in the soil and soil itself. It passes through this very simple body, which is essentially a tube, taking the nutrients from it, and it comes out the other end. And what comes out is more alkaline than what went in, and up to 50% more nitrogen, potassium, and phosphates. So it enriches the soil. So in fact, it's a composting machine. The reason why you see more worm casts in the autumn is because it's wetter. And worms dry out if they're exposed. They hate the dry. So in autumn, when it's damper, they come nearer the surface, and therefore their casts are much more likely to be found on the surface. The best thing you can possibly do with them is brush them. It's as simple as that. So if you have a brush and just spread them around, spread the worm casts, and all you're doing is putting compost back onto the soil. And remember, this is more rich in every way than the soil itself. So you are improving the soil and spreading it in. The other thing that worms do is aerate the soil. And aeration is the best thing that can happen to a lawn. And by autumn, you've been walking on it, you've been mowing it, it's got compacted. So worms are doing the job for you, but you can help them and you can help yourself by simply opening the soil out a little bit. And the easiest way to do that is just with a fork, go in the ground, loosen it up. And if you do this before you brush the worm casts, you'll brush the worm casts into the holes. And the final thing you can do, which has nothing to do with worms, but is perfectly good lawn care in autumn, is to scratch out all the thatch or dead material. So get a wire rake and just rake it over like that. And you can see straight away it's amazing how much dead material you can get in a relatively small area. And this is thatch. This is dead grass, moss, leaves, and it will all sit on top of the grass, stopping light and air and moisture getting in. So brush off the worm casts, aerate it, rake it, and celebrate the worms. Well, that's it for today. I'll be back here, of course, at Longmeadow at the same time next week, and I hope this lovely autumnal weather lasts a little bit longer and you can enjoy it as much as possible. Bye-bye.